On the borderlands of West Virginia and Kentucky, the ridges run dark and close, pressing down on hollows where families carve out their lives with axe and rifle. In the years after the Civil War, blood still lingered in the soil, brothers had fought on different sides, neighbors carried grudges like scars that never healed. Out of that silence rose two names that would be burned into American memory, the Hatfields and the McCoys. Once they had been neighbors. They hunted the same woods, crossed the same river bends, married into the same kin networks. But in Appalachia, kinship could be a shield, or a sword. By the late 1870s, resentment smoldered in Tug Fork Valley. One side leaned Confederate, the other Unionist, one claimed stolen property, the other claimed insulted honor. And when pride was at stake, even the smallest spark could set the forest ablaze. That spark came in the form of a hog. A single animal, argued over in a backwoods trial, judged by men tied to one clan more than the other. The verdict cut deeper than any blade, the McCoys called it theft, the Hatfields called it justice. From that moment, what should have ended in laughter ended instead in death. A man testified, a man was killed, and blood began to answer blood. Yet the feud was not just about livestock, or courts, or grudges of war. It reached into the intimate, into forbidden love, broken hearts, and betrayal at the hearth. Rosanna McCoy, who gave her trust to John Hatfield, found herself abandoned, her tragedy whispered as legend. Soon the feud became a cycle of killings, brothers stabbed, sons executed, cabins set aflame. Each act of violence carved a deeper wound, until the feud no longer belonged to the families, it belonged to history itself. By the 1880s, the hills of Appalachia were echoing with rifle fire, and the newspapers of New York and Boston were printing their names in bold letters. To outsiders, it was savagery in the mountains. To the Hatfields and McCoys, it was survival, honor, vengeance, written in blood. Tonight, we step into that story. We follow how neighbors became enemies, how a hog turned into a graveyard, how love turned into ruin. This is the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a tale of Appalachia where pride was more deadly than bullets, and where the echoes of violence still linger along Tug Fork's quiet waters. If you find this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the feud is about to begin. The Tug Fork threads a narrow channel through the Cumberland Mountains, a cold arm of the Big Sandy that marks, almost casually, the line between Pike County, Kentucky, and the West Virginia hills that were once Logan County and, by 1895, would be carved into Mingo. On the Kentucky bank, the McCoys kept their fields along Grapevine Creek. Across the water, the Hatfields scattered their cabins through the wooded hollows near Island Creek. The river isn't wide here. A man's voice can cross it. So could favors, gossip, and, when the time came, bullets. In the late 1870s the country wore a second-growth coat, oak and chestnut on the ridges, laurel thickets clutching the slopes, corn coaxed from whatever patch of hillside would hold a plow. Roads were more intention than infrastructure, corduroy over mud, ruts that drowned in spring and froze uneven in winter. Hogs ranged en masse in the fall, feeding themselves under trees that belonged to everyone and no one. Law, like mail, arrived on delay. Arguments that in a town would have meant clerks and paper were, in these hills, settled on porches or in the one-room office of a justice of the peace with neighbors for a jury. It was not lawlessness, it was the law of closeness. The Civil War had ended, but not here. Allegiances split families with a neatness the map could not show. William Anderson, Devil Aunts Hatfield, a Confederate veteran with the presence of a timber boss and a soldier's calm, held sway on the West Virginia side. Randolph Randell McCoy, square-shouldered and tight-lipped in the photographs that survive, farmed his acres on the Kentucky bank with Sarah, his wife, and a large brood. Between them lay a wound no court had closed, Asa Harmon McCoy, Randolph's brother, who wore Union blue and, in 1865, came home to be killed in the shadow of peace. People whispered the names of men tied to the old Logan Wildcats, and Devil Aunts' uncle, Jim Vance, passed from rumor to certainty in local talk. No verdict fixed the blame. The memory did not need one. In the mountains, grief keeps better than winter apples. Cash was scarce. Corn, timber, livestock, and labor were the currencies that mattered. Of these, the hog mattered most. A pig was a winter's worth of meals and a year's insurance, a bank account on 4 legs. Because fences were rare and range was open, identity lived in the ears, slits, crops, and bits, a small alphabet of notches every neighbor could read. If your mark was on a hog, the hog was yours. If someone disputed it, they were testing more than ownership, they were testing your ability to feed your children. In a place where reputation was capital, to call a man a hog thief threatened his livelihood and his standing in one breath. Power followed kin more than office. Justices of the peace were often neighbors, jurors could be cousins, a deacon might also be a timber partner. On the West Virginia bank, Hatfield alliances ran dense through the hollows, Devil Aunts himself, his kinsman Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield, the volatile Jim Vance. On the Kentucky side, the names that would soon matter were already grown and working, Tolbert, farmer, Bud McCoy, sons accustomed to the long gun and the tight budgets of hard seasons. Weddings braided those networks, funerals gathered them. Closeness kept the peace when times were good. When times turned, the breaking was personal. Sundays and election days held the valley together. A revival could pull half a watershed into one clearing, a stump speech could do the same. Whiskey was expected, not excused. Men who had learned in the war how quickly quiet can turn didn't trust crowds, but they went anyway. Pistols were common now, but the rifle still ruled the ridges, a tool for deer and a ready threat for men. The tools of work, axes, knives, the rifles kept for meat, were also the grammar of warning. With the nearest courthouse over bad roads and across a river, the first answer to a problem was rarely a letter to Frankfort or Charleston. The land enforced privacy. Fog hung in the bottoms as if nailed there, snow closed the poor roads without asking the sheriff. A deputy who crossed the Tug Fork to serve a warrant knew his authority thinned with every step away from his own courthouse. Jurisdiction followed politics as much as maps, and the politics didn't agree. Trouble slipped between states like water through planks, leaving both governors angry and neither entirely in command. Change was coming, the kind that rode rails and signed timber deeds in offices far from the hollows. But in the years before company men arrived with surveys and contracts, the valley still ran on reciprocity. A cleared field might pay for a borrowed mule, a month's work raising a neighbor's barn might settle an old debt. Pride was not ornament, it held the structure up. A reputation for fairness carried a man's name further than cash could, a reputation for cheating could starve him. That is why a hog could carry more moral weight than its carcass. If a neighbor said your mark sat on his pig, he wasn't just taking meat, he was sawing at the beam that kept your family standing. Unwritten rules shaped the settlements that clung to the river bends. Steep grades decided where cabins stood, open range made ear notches more reliable than fences, a church meeting might double as a hearing, and every handshake still had the shadow of the war behind it. The valley held its stories close, and every story had a listener ready to carry it across the water by evening. A glow on a ridge meant a fire, by morning it had a narrative attached, and by sunset 3 versions, each with a different edge. 2 names fixed the outline of the place, William Anderson, Devil Aunts Hatfield on the West Virginia bank, and Randolph McCoy on the Kentucky side. Around them were sons, cousins, uncles, in-laws, a lattice you could climb if you knew the names and fall from if you didn't. If peace held, it was because that weave stayed tight. When peace snapped, the weave cut. Before the headlines and the photographs, before oath-bound posses and governors banging out letters, the valley rehearsed a small drama that had ended 100 times without blood, a dispute over a pig and the notches in its ears. The proper stage was a cramped room before a familiar justice. The witnesses were men who knew each other's corn cribs and children's names and could swear who cut which mark and when. On most days, such a quarrel closed by supper time, and the neighbors walked home with their dignity intact. But the years had lined the air with dry leaves. Old memory lay underfoot, waiting to catch a toe. Kinship filled the jury box and thinned the distance between the accused and the accusers. In 1878, when Randolph McCoy said a hog with a certain ear told a certain story and Floyd Hatfield said it told another, the valley did not just weigh property, it tested trust. They gathered to end a quarrel. What they received was a spark. It began with a pen, a fence no higher than a man's knee, and a hog that wore its identity in the flesh of its ears. In the fall of 1878, Randolph McCoy walked past a pen and saw an animal he swore bore the McCoy marks, those small cuts, crops, and splits, that in open-range country were as binding as a deed. The hog, however, stood behind the rails of Floyd Hatfield, cousin to Devil Aunts. In a valley where winter meat could mean the difference between getting through and going under, a marked hog was not a trifle. It was a trust. And trust, once challenged, pulled men toward a judge. They chose the nearest authority the hills would recognize, Anderson, preacher Aunts Hatfield, a Baptist minister and justice of the peace, who agreed to hear the matter at a Hatfield cabin within earshot of the Tug Fork. Neighbors came down the path, men who knew one another's children in corn cribs, some wearing the Hatfield name, some the McCoy. In a narrow room where the Bible sat never far from the law book, they swore to what they had seen, and to what they believed those notches meant. It was the kind of proceeding mountain people trusted, faces known, speech plain, the stakes intimate. Floyd spoke for his pen, he had cut the marks, he said, and fed the hog, and no man could claim what another had raised. Randolph answered with the stubborn calm of a man who had measured his words against a winter's ledger. The room weighed ears and honor in the same breath. You could feel the old war hanging in the rafters, the habit of choosing sides, of tallying slights like a ledger in pencil, yet this was not a skirmish with rifles. It was a quarrel about proof, pressed into the shape of a trial. Then came the witness whose name the valley would not forgive. Bill Staton, a relative tied by marriage into both networks, stood up for Floyd. He said he had seen the marks cut, and his words favored the Hatfield side. In a place where kinship is a rope, a man who climbs it the wrong way will feel it burn. The verdict followed his testimony, the hog stayed with Floyd. What should have ended with a handshake ended, instead, with a silence you could feel from one bank of the Tug to the other. On another day, in a softer year, the quarrel might have dropped like a stone and vanished into the river's noise. But the valley had grown dry with memory. The McCoys carried off the loss as an insult paid in public, the Hatfields carried off the verdict as justice done and witnessed. Even the jury, neighbors from both sides, left with a new weight on the tongue. A McCoy kinsman, Selkirk McCoy, had sided with the Hatfields, his choice would be remembered with a special bitterness when the lists of wrongs were rehearsed around kitchen fires. The truth of a feud is that it rarely begins with thunder. It begins with a change in the weather. After the trial, men who had traded labor began to count favors with closer fingers. A joke died before it crossed a porch. Whiskey found quicker purchase at elections and revivals. Boys learned, without being told, which path home kept them out of the other family's gaze. The valley's old confidence, the idea that a dispute could be settled by familiar voices in a small room, had taken a wound. The wound soon bled. Bill Staton went into the woods one June day in 1880 and did not come out. Randolph's nephews, Sam and Paris McCoy, killed him there among the trees. They stood trial and walked free on a verdict of self-defense, but a verdict could not bury what the act had turned over. To the Hatfields, a man who had spoken truth as he saw it had been hunted, to the McCoys, a traitor in kin's clothing had met a fate the hills understood. Either way, Staton's grave hardened the trial's edge into a blade. What the hog meant in that room was never only fat and meat. It meant whether a man's word could anchor property in a country without fences, whether the mark you cut into a living ear counted when another man claimed the same strokes of the knife. The verdict said, yes, to one family and, no, to the other. What echoed after was the sound of justice losing its common shape. Once that shape blurs, every later quarrel arrives wearing a mask you recognize, the face of the last one that hurt. You could hear the change in the way people spoke of election day. Before, it had been the valley's carnival of politics and quarrels, where men cut deals while fiddles scraped into dusk and the whiskey jug went shoulder to shoulder. After the Hog trial, election crowds looked like tinder. The old habit of stepping in between, of saying, "That's enough," and shooing a cousin home, no longer felt like a safe errand. The trial had announced a new grammar: when a verdict didn't close a matter, men would try a different language. There were other troubles moving in the background: timber claims that mapped money onto ridges where money had rarely flowed, land disputes argued in courthouses far from the river bends. If the hog seemed small beside those sums, it was only because the hog stood close enough to touch. A man might accept the judgment of a distant court on a line scratched across a hillside, but a pig inside his neighbor's pen, with the wrong cuts in its ears, could make his hands shake. So the valley tightened. Hatfield cabins watched the Kentucky bank the way a hunter watches tree line. McCoy porches stared back across the water as if the river itself had chosen sides. Old friends began to pass each other like strangers, and strangers began to look like scouts. When a man raised a rifle to shoot a deer, his mind traveled a road it hadn't taken before. Who would hear the shot, and what would it mean on the other bank? The hills keep no minutes, yet they keep account. From the day of the trial, a ledger no clerk could close began to fill with entries: a word spoken with heat at a mill, a look held too long on the road, a cousin who changed his route home at dusk. Each small mark deepened the page. The killing of Bill Stanton added its heavy line. And beneath all of it, like a vein of coal nobody had yet dug, lay the conviction on both sides that honor had been handled wrong. When people later said, with a shrug meant to sound worldly, it started over a hog, they were not wrong. They were only speaking in shorthand. What they meant was this: the first fire was small, but it found the dry grass that years of memory had laid down. Once lit, it walked the hollows on its own feet. It would be fed by love gone crooked, by whiskey, by old soldiers who knew how to turn a corner quiet and fast. It would take men out of their beds on election day and set pawpaw trees behind 3 boys who would never see another sunrise. But that is later. For now, the river runs as it always has, indifferent, pushing past the cabin where neighbors once swore to ear notches and to truth as they understood it. The verdict stands, and the room is empty. Outside, the paths split, one toward Kentucky, one toward West Virginia, and the men who walk them carry something they did not bring in, a quarrel that will not stay put. They met with the easy boldness of youth, where a river bend believes itself private and a crowd at a country gathering feels like permission. He was Johnson Hatfield, handsome and quick to smile, a son of devil aunts with a fiddle player's charm and a trader's tongue. She was Rosanna McCoy, dark-haired, watchful, born to the Kentucky bank where the McCoy cabins held their line along Grapevine Creek. If the two surnames sounded like gunlocks snapping back, the names, Johns and Rosanna, did not. For a while they were only a boy and a girl who liked the way the other stood in the light. The valley did not give long childhoods. Work measured the days, water to haul, stock to feed, corn to hoe. But courting, when it came, found its hours anyway. Johns crossed the river when the light went soft. He liked to arrive with a joke and leave with a promise. Rosanna learned the rhythm of his steps on the path and the pitch of his voice when he meant to be heard only by her. The mountains have their own privacy. You can speak low beneath a sycamore and believe the leaves will keep your secrets. Everyone in the Tug Fork country knew that love could stitch families together. Everyone also knew it could rip seams wide. A Hatfield and a McCoy was not just a pairing, it was a declaration. Yet in the first months, the families did not turn like armies. People watched. Some hoped this would be one of those rare crossings that quieted a valley. Others counted the reasons it would not. There were nights when Rosanna slipped across the water and stayed with the Hatfields, a scandal to her kin and an open-armed welcome to devil aunts, who enjoyed the proof that even McCoy daughters could choose his side. Around the Hatfield hearth she was treated kindly, fed, fussed over, teased as if she had always belonged. That hospitality cut 2 ways. For the McCoys, it looked like triumph wrapped as generosity. For the Hatfields, it looked like a blessing the mountains themselves had signed. The rough truth underneath was simpler: a girl had given her trust to a boy who was not built for keeping it. Johns liked speed. He liked the chase more than the staying. In the first clear days of their courtship, it did not matter. He swore what young men swear, and Rosanna believed what young women believe when believing feels like breath. By winter, she was carrying his child. Shame can pass through a kitchen quicker than smoke. The McCoy house filled with the low voices of older women and the hard silence of men thinking about names, and futures, and whether forgiveness was wisdom or weakness. Rosanna saw what her condition had done to the faces she loved. She felt how narrow a valley can be when it decides that a girl is a lesson to others. She kept to shadows, then to rooms, then to long walks at odd hours, finding places where a woman could cry without the trees repeating it. She might still have been gathered back in. Families are bundles of second chances, if Johns had steadied. Instead, the river's crosswind caught him. There were whispers of flirtations that ran faster than his promises could cover them. Men told stories in which Johns traded as well with feelings as with timber, and Devil Ansa's son stood in them with pockets full and eyes elsewhere. When talk arranged itself into a single hard fact, it came like a snapped branch. Johns married Nancy McCoy, Rosanna's cousin. The valley understood the cruelty of that arrangement at once. It was not only desertion, it was a humiliation worked in the language of kin. A wedding connects a web, this one carved it. At the McCoy table, a mother sat with her hand on a daughter's wrist and watched the room not know where to glance. At the Hatfield fire, a few faces turned toward the door as if expecting Rosanna to come and claim what was hers. She did not. You can say a woman's heart breaks and mean it as a figure. In a place like Tug Fork, the figure keeps company with the literal. Sleep deserts, appetite thins, the hands cannot keep to their tasks. Rosanna's grief grew quiet and heavy. The child inside her carried both surnames without protection from either. Neighbors who would once have met her eyes now studied the ground a beat too long before looking up. She learned to wear her sadness like another garment, plain, clean, and impossible to remove. There are stories the valley never settled and never will, whether Rosanna, in a moment of loyalty to love or fury at kin, warned the Hatfields about a plan to seize Johns, whether she sat up nights listening for footsteps and mistook the sound of a twig for the start of a posse, whether the warning, if it came, bought Johns an hour or a lifetime. The mountains do not notarize every moment. What the valley did keep was the shape of the loss. A young woman crossed her family's line for a promise that failed her, and the failure salted a wound already open between two banks of a narrow river. Her name slid into the stories people told at dusk. In some versions she is a Juliet with mud on her shoes and river water on her hem. In others she is a caution, fire that leapt the creek and set the other bank alight. In all of them she stands half-turned, listening, as if one more footstep from the path might still be his. The child in her arms is sometimes a future and sometimes a grave. The people who tell the tale choose which, depending on how stern they want their lesson to be. But there is no version where her life returns to what it was. Once the river is crossed for love, it does not shrink back to the trickle it used to be. This was the moment when the feud learned the intimacy of the hearth. Before, men had quarreled about property and verdicts, about ear notches and testimony. Those quarrels were hot but public. Rosanna's story moved the anger indoors. Women carried it in whispers, men in clenched jaws. Cousins picked sides they had hoped never to pick, and the old habit of working through trouble with a nod and a shared chore wore thin. If a boy on one bank laughed too freely, the other bank heard a mockery in it. If a girl on one bank sang a love song, the other bank listened for names. Time did its work as it always does, adding ordinary days to extraordinary pain until both felt inseparable. A baby's cry. A kettle set to boil. The river in flood, then in drought, then in flood again. Yet the ledger that the valley kept, no clerk's book, but a harder one, added an entry in ink that would not wash, a McCoy daughter wronged by a Hatfield son. You could argue the details around a stove until the wood burned to ash, you could not argue the shape of the wound. And the wound changed how the valley approached its gatherings. Election day had always been a festival with sharp edges, fiddles, whiskey, speeches, boasts. After Rosanna, the edges felt like knives already drawn. Men arrived with talk of ballots and left with talk of settling scores. A brother could be led into trouble more easily by the thought of a sister's tears than by any lecture on honor, and more than one McCoy looked across the water with the new appetite that grief invents. By the late summer, when crowds again pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath banners and tree shade, the air held a different weight. You could smell rain and gun oil together. Old soldiers who had learned to read a room the way hunters read signs shifted their stance and measured the exits. The river ran at its usual pace, pretending indifference, but the banks held their breath. What followed would not be a quarrel conducted in a cramped cabin over a single animal. It would be public and unanswerable and done in daylight, the kind of act that shoves a valley past the point where words can reach. Before the sun set on an election day, a Hatfield would fall cut and bleeding, and devil aunts would answer with a sentence carried out beneath pawpaw leaves. The feud had found its fuel in love. Now it would learn what fire does when it meets wind. Election day brought the valley together the way revivals did, fiddles in the shade, whiskey passed from hand to hand, candidates working a crowd that wanted politics brisk and promises plain. On the Kentucky side, the polls stood near the creeks and wagon ruts like a fair sprung from the earth. By afternoon the air was hot with talk and damp with sweat, and the names that mattered most in Tug Fork country, Hatfield, McCoy, moved through the press of bodies like weather. Ellison Hatfield came in with his size and good humor and a soldier's stance. He was Devil Aunt's brother, a man whose laugh could carry and whose temper, people said, was as slow to rouse as a bear in winter. Tolbert McCoy was there too, with his younger brothers Farmer and Bud close by, the three of them tight with the pride and recklessness of young men convinced they could balance on the knife edge between boast and fight. Words were exchanged, sharp, then sharper. Shoulder brushed shoulder. The crowd leaned in, as crowds do, hungry for a story to tell after sundown. What happened next no two tellings agree on in the small strokes, but the large ones a line, a knife, then more knives, then a gunshot that cracked the afternoon. Ellison went down, stabbed again and again, more than 20 wounds in all, and shot once for punctuation. The dirt darkened under him while the music stopped without anyone telling it to. There are moments when a valley decides what it will be. Men rushed in, but not all with the same intent. Hatfield kin, constables among them, seized the McCoy boys before the crowd could break into sides. The law, such as it was, put hands on the three brothers and turned their faces toward Pikeville for trial. Behind that show of order, another current ran, messengers riding hard for devil aunts, men leaving the polling place not for their homes but for rifles cached where they could be reached in a hurry. Along the road out, the escort was intercepted. The McCoy boys were not taken to a courthouse. They were taken toward the river. Ellison did not die at the polls. He bled and fought through the night, watched over by Hatfield kin who measured his breathing as if it were a clock telling them what to do next. On the far bank, word reached the McCoy cabin that Randolph's sons were being held and that aunts waited to see which way the balance would tip. It tipped with the news that Ellison was gone. Whatever patience or procedure had been promised at the first hour was withdrawn at the second. The three McCoy brothers were marched to a strip of low ground near the Tug Fork where pawpaw trees grew thick enough to make shade in August. They were tied there, one to each slender trunk. A volley answered Ellison's death, and then another, 50 shots by some counts, the noise rolling across the water and up the hollows like a storm. When the smoke thinned, the bodies hung forward against the bark. The execution took place within sight of the river and within earshot of anyone who still believed such things would be settled in court. Pike County would mark the spot later with a sign for travelers. Buskirk, Kentucky, the marker says, a short walk from the tug. But the people who lived through that summer needed no metal plate to tell them where the world had shifted. The trial that should have been had been replaced by a sentence carried out beneath green leaves. Mothers who had taught their boys to keep their hands clean for Sunday services counted the holes in those boys' shirts and asked what use prayers were in a valley that listened more closely to rifles than to scripture. For a little while, there was quiet, part shock, part the numbness that follows a broken bone. The Hatfields called it justice returned as cleanly as a debt. The McCoys called it murder done in daylight. In cabins up and down both banks, the talk took on a new hardness. Men who had once stepped between cousins now stayed on their side of the river and watched the opposite bank the way a hunter watches a thicket he knows holds something that does not intend to be seen. Children were called in earlier. Dogs barked at night with more success at waking their masters. Vengeance does not travel alone. It brings kin, neighbors, hired hands, men with grudges of their own who sign on for the ride and tell themselves it's honor that spurs them. The months that followed the pawpaw trees were busy with small raids and night rides, with gates lifted off hinges and warning shots fired at cabin corners where lamplight showed. It was not yet a war with lines and set-piece battles, but it had the rhythm of one, probe, answer, injury, reply. The old license of a shared valley thinned. Where a man might once have crossed the water to borrow a tool, he now sent a boy along the ridge to fetch it from someone on his own side. Law tried to stand up to the new weather and found the ground slick. Kentucky had men it called officers, and so did West Virginia, but warrants grew weak when they got wet in the Tug Fork, and deputies were braver within earshot of their own courthouse than across the line. The families' names were the valley's map, offices were a distant overlay. In that space between, rumor did the work of summonses and ambush did the work of arrest. Newspapers began to ransom the facts, trading them for headlines that made Eastern readers gasp at the savagery of mountain people. Print turned the feud into theater, and theater always wants another act. But the valley's memory held more than the rifle reports. It kept the averted eyes at church when a bereaved mother slid onto a bench. It kept the silence that spread in a room when a Hatfield and a McCoy found themselves sharing it and no one trusted the furniture to hold the weight of their staring. It kept the dull ache that followed a woman from stove to cradle to well when she measured what had been taken from her house and what might yet be taken. The feud had begun as a dark, public quarrel. Now it lived in kitchens and behind doors, an ache the size of a family. Whiskey kept its place in the story, as whiskey often does when men are trying to teach themselves that they do not feel what they feel. Election days came around again, the calendar insists on it, and so did speeches and songs and the clatter of tin cups. But the crowd moved with a new caution, like cattle crossing a swollen stream. You could see it in the gaps that opened between men who used to stand elbow to elbow, hear it in the way a laugh would die halfway across a mouth when a familiar surname drifted near. When a raid did flare into shooting, it burned fast and left edges jagged. A barn was torched, a fence was slashed, a cousin who should have been safe slipped down in the leaves with his breath turning shallow and then still. Word galloped faster than horses, who had been seen where, who had fired first, who swore a new oath over the bed of the one who would not wake. For every man taken to a magistrate, 2 were judged by neighbors who decided they were done with paper and ink. The feud had learned to conduct itself in the open, with the confidence that comes when men decide they know best how justice ought to look. If a stranger had ridden through and asked what the quarrel was now about, a dozen answers would have presented themselves: the hog, the girl, Ellison, the 3 brothers left under the pawpaws, a side insulted, a debt unpaid. Each answer was true and not enough. The feud had escaped its reasons, it was the weather now, not the forecast. You did not talk about ending it any more than you talked about ending rain. You talked about what you would do when it came again. Yet even in this weather, there were gestures that tried for the old normal: a loan repaid on time, a gate lifted and set back carefully, a man raising his hat when he passed a woman from the other side. They looked small against the ledger of blood, but men remembered them. In the end, those small gestures would be the bridge back, though the crossing would not begin for years and would leave a long wake behind it. By late 1882 and into the next seasons, a kind of dread settled in among the hill shadows. It showed itself in how quickly men took to cover when a dog barked at the wrong hour, in how children learned without instruction which names to avoid in street games, in how the river's nighttime voice, the slip of water on stone, began to sound like someone whispering that the worst had not happened yet. The valley listened, and the whisper made sense. It was right. The worst had not happened yet. The first day of a new year would bring it. Long before dawn on January 1st, 1888, men would come over the ground like a storm arriving early, and a cabin on Grapevine Creek would glow like a coal blown back to life. A woman would cry out, a daughter would run for the door, shots would turn the new year old in a heartbeat. But that is ahead. For now, the memory of Ellison's fall at the polls and the 3 boys bound beneath green leaves was enough to keep sleep shallow and tempers quick. The mountains held their breath, and the feud drew its own. The last night of the old year came down cold and hard on Grapevine Creek. Frost silvered the split-rail fences, the river ran low and black, dogs barked at things they could not name. In the McCoy cabin, lamplight drew a small circle against a dark that belonged to the hills. Randolph slept light, as men do who have enemies. Sarah dozed with the ache that never left a mother's bones. The children lay in the quilt's shallow warmth and dreamed the ordinary dreams of winter. Before dawn, shadows detached themselves from the timber and moved like a thought arriving. Men took their places around the cabin. Some carried the Hatfield name by blood, some by marriage, some by oath. A few wore their faces the way night hunters do, with eyes narrowed and mouths set against second thoughts. Among them were William, Cap, Hatfield and Jim Vance, names that could tilt a room. They did not come for talk. They came for an ending. The first sound was a command barked low, the sort of word that assumes obedience. The second was the thud of a boot against a door. When wood held, fire took its turn. Kindling stacked where a wall met the porch caught and climbed, orange pushing at the slats as if the house had begun to breathe smoke. The family woke into confusion, Randolph up and reaching for a rifle, Sarah pulling children toward the floor, someone shouting that they were surrounded. Heat pressed the window glass, sparks snapped and wheeled into the dark. They called for Randolph. He did not answer. A pane went to splinters under a gunstock and the cabin's small world broke open. Shots slapped the door and bit into the logs. The family ran the narrow choices a burning house allows, stay and choke or run and be seen. Calvin McCoy went first, a young man shouldering into the open because there is a point at which breath and pride agree. He fell hard in the yard with firelight on his shirt. Ollie Fair, quick, slight, carrying the terror of those who have decided the running is worth the risk, pushed after him. A shot caught her as she crossed the threshold. She pitched to the dirt within reach of the people calling for her to stop. The new year had its first dead before daylight. Inside, Sarah tried to shield who she could and shout sense into the chaos. A gun barrel or club swung at her head, accounts do not agree on which, only on the result, and the blow cracked the world into a ringing that would follow her for the rest of her days. She went down with blood in her hair and the taste of ash in her mouth, half conscious, clawing across the floor toward a child's small hand. Randolph, smoke-stung and raw with fury, broke through a gap at the back and fled into the dark scrub along the slope. The men outside cursed at the empty doorway and aimed at shadows, but the hills know how to hide their own. Neighbors saw the glow and came when they could without choosing sides too quickly. They found what the dawn always reveals after men have done their worst, a yard churned by boots, cartridge brass winking in the ash, bodies cooling in the open, a woman broken but breathing, the smell of burnt sap and cooked boards. Someone fetched water and threw it at what was left of the porch, more for the comfort of the gesture than for any use it could make. Someone else took off a coat and tried to lay it over Alifair's stillness, as if warmth were a kindness that could pass backward. Word jumped the creek and rode the hollows. It went first as shock, this cannot be, and then as something harder that left no room for surprise. The Hatfields had always said the law could not be trusted when their people were concerned, the McCoys had always said the Hatfields' law looked like a rifle. The night's work proved both points to their own adherents and hardened the rest of the valley against the men who had lit the fire. There is a kind of violence the country tolerates and a kind it does not. Shooting men outside a cabin counts as a feud. Dragging a family into it and leaving a mother in the ashes reads as something else. Newspapers found the story before the embers cooled. Columns in distant cities wrote it as theater, dark mountains, savage clans, a new year christened by gunfire, each paragraph widening the audience and narrowing the nuance. Eastern readers learned the names the way playgoers learn a cast: Devil Aunts, Randell, Cap, Vance. They learned a setting: Grapevine Creek, Tug Fork, Buskirk. They learned a verdict: the mountain feud had become a barbarity that needed to be put down. The families learned with a fresh jolt what it is to become emblem rather than neighbor. The state learned too. Kentucky's pride took the form of a warrant with teeth. West Virginia's pride took the form of insisting its courts would not be raided by men from across the river. Into that standoff rode a figure who seemed made for the moment: Frank "Bad" Phillips, a deputy with a taste for hard travel and a belief that law, to be respected here, had to look like the men it meant to command. He gathered a posse that included McCoy's sympathizers and trackers who knew the breaks in the ridges by heart. They crossed lines with the confidence of people who think their cause is larger than a map. The hunt ran first on rumor and then on sign. A scuffed leaf, a cold ash bed, the way a branch sprung back a breath slower than wind would allow, men who have tracked hogs and deer and one another read such pages the way a literate man reads print. In a laurel thicket not far from the raid, Jim Vance met the end that feuds right for men who have become their symbols. He went down in a confusion of shouting and brush, a shot finding him where the mountain offered no further cover. To some, it was justice. To others, proof that Kentucky had decided to wage its own law in foreign hills. Arrests followed, Hatfield men hauled from beds and barns, a handful seized not by extradition but by force, bundled across the Tug Fork to cells in Pikeville. The law would later argue over whether such seizures stained the cases beyond repair. The families did not wait for a ruling. They counted who had been taken and guessed at what those men might say under oath. A valley that had once trusted neighbor testimony found itself watching strange words enter the record: jurisdiction, governor's warrant, writ. The feud had climbed a courthouse's steps whether it wished to or not. For Sarah McCoy there were no legal terms, only the long slow business of surviving a blow to the head and the blows that followed it, memories that refused to fall into a single line, the ache of a house with empty places at the table. She carried herself as mountain women do, with a stubbornness that is almost prayer. People lowered their voices when she entered a room and tried to hold their faces in a shape that would not add to her pain. It did not help much. Grief has its own arithmetic, and words rarely balance it. Randolph grew older in a year. The rage that had kept him moving through the winter brush set into something colder. He understood the story the valley would tell with his name in it and did not bother to correct what could not be corrected. When he stood at a window and looked toward the river, it was not to search for movement on the far bank. It was to measure how much of himself had been left on the ground that morning. The massacre did what the hog trial and the pawpaw trees had not, it made the feud a matter for crowds. When one of the arrested men, Ellison Cottontop Mounts, simple, young, tied to the Hatfields by blood, came to trial, the courthouse filled beyond its ability to hold the curious. People traveled miles to see a human shape pressed into the part of villain or victim, depending on which telling they brought with them. Witnesses spoke, lawyers said the words lawyers say when trying to carve certainty out of a fog, the jury returned with the sentence the valley expected. There would be a hanging. They built the gallows in Pikeville. The crowd that gathered did so with the fascination and shame that always attend public punishment. Children craned, men made jokes that dried in their mouths, women stared straight ahead because to look away would have meant admitting they were not equal to what the day required. The rope did its work in 1890 and left silence behind it. For some, that silence was relief, a debt paid. For others, it clanged like a lid, one more entry in the ledger of wrongs. Either way, the spectacle announced that the feud, once a private grammar, had become the state's language too. After the hanging, the hills did not grow kinder. But something in them shifted. The show of law, bloody, public, unambiguous, taught the valley that there are endings which do not ask permission. Bad, Frank kept writing, more Hatfields stood before judges, more McCoys learned the way an oath tastes when it has to be spoken about a neighbor. The river went on cataloging stones, the cabins went on breathing smoke, and yet the air lay a little lighter for the first time in years, as if the country had decided that the worst of the weather was passing. The story that began with notches in a pig's ear now wore ropes and warrants and inked signatures. Governors wrote letters with heat in them, lawyers cited cases whose names belonged to other towns, the feud's actors found themselves translated into evidence. What had once been settled on porches now sat under a judge's gaze. The families would not agree that justice had arrived, but they could not deny that something larger than their quarrel had taken hold. The next chapters would be written in courtrooms and on courthouse lawns, in testimony and transcripts, in sentences measured not in bullets but in years. The valley would stand in crowds and watch the law make theater of its pain. And whether they liked the play or not, the end of it would carry them closer to a quiet they could keep. After Grapevine Creek, the feud stepped into rooms with flags and benches and clocks that measured pain in hours instead of heartbeats. Posse riders gave way to sheriffs in coats, ambushes gave way to subpoenas written in careful hands. The hills did not trust paper, but paper came anyway, stamped and signed and backed by men who meant to prove that maps were stronger than rivers. They brought the first prisoners across the Tug Fork at night, roped 2 and 2, wet to the waist. Lanterns swung above courthouse steps in Pikeville, swinging the shadows of men against brick like warnings. The crowd packed itself into the hall even when the docket held other names, waiting for the moment when a deputy would call out a Hatfield or a man tied to one. Women leaned forward with knitting forgotten in their laps. Boys climbed the window sills until a bailiff hissed them down. A hush fell in layers, first upon the benches, then upon the stairway, then upon the street outside, until the only sounds were the scrape of a chair and the soft click of a watch lid opening. What the law wanted first was jurisdiction, whose prisoner, whose judge, whose gallows if it came to that. Kentucky said, ours, because the fire lit on our soil. West Virginia said, not so fast, because men were seized in our hollows without the courtesy of a warrant properly served. Lawyers spoke like carpenters, fitting cases and precedents together with mallets of logic. Somewhere between capitals, governors exchanged letters that began as argument and ended as insult. The prisoners stayed behind iron while the states argued about where iron belonged. The valley, which had learned to measure men by the weight of their rifles, learned how they look under cross-examination. A farmer who had once named ear notches now tried to be precise about lamplight and distances. A woman whose hands still shook described the shape of a hat in fire glow. Bad Frank Phillips, dust ground into the seams of his coat, told how he followed Prince through Laurel and how rumor turns true when you find the ember it blew from. Defense attorneys stood their men up straight and asked the jury to consider what a feud does to memory. Prosecutors answered that the dead spoke clearly enough. The trials multiplied. Some ended with years that would be lived out behind stone, some with acquittals that felt to the crowd like bargains struck in back rooms they were not invited to enter. The name that drew the tightest knot of onlookers belonged to a young man with pale hair and troubled eyes, Ellison Cottontop Mounts. He was not a patriarch nor a captain of anything, only kin, only present, only reachable by a law hungry to prove it could close at least one circle. Witnesses placed him at the cabin in the smoke of the new year. The jury's return was quick, the sentence written in a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper underneath. They raised the gallows in Pikeville as if building a stage. Wagons rolled in early, men tied their horses to anything that would stand, families climbed onto rooftops when the yard filled. Nobody liked to call it entertainment, but the crowd behaved exactly as a crowd does before a show, speculating about lines, guessing endings, asking whether the noose would snap clean. When Cottontop walked out, you could feel the moment pass from rumor into history. Someone shouted a prayer. Someone else shouted his name. The rope did what ropes do, and a silence fell so pure and sudden that even the courthouse clock seemed to apologize for striking the hour. Spectacle satisfied some and hardened others. To the McCoys who had stood over holes in the ground and spoken the names of their dead, the hanging tasted like a debt paid in the only coin left to spend. To the Hatfields who watched a simple-minded boy swing for a night planned by sharper men, it tasted like vengeance dressed as law. The newspapers tasted ink and filled columns with it, sketches of the scaffold, biographies abridged to a paragraph, talk of mountain savagery made small enough to fit between advertisements for patent tonics. Photographers posed jurors and deputies on courthouse steps, their faces set in the moral certainty of people who believe they have finally drawn a line a valley must not cross again. Behind the show, the machinery kept turning. More indictments. More habeas petitions. Sheriffs escorting prisoners down corridors that smelled of damp stone and lamp oil. A judge from one state sent writs that men in another state ignored with shrugs practiced to look like courage. Word came down from a high court far away that the manner of a man's capture did not, in the end, wash the blood from his hands nor bar a trial from washing them officially. Lawyers nodded solemnly and then argued the next motion. Families listened for what the ruling meant in kitchens where coffee went cold. For those who were not hanged but sentenced, the world narrowed to a set of routines. Iron doors, counted steps, the weight of a striped shirt. A man who had known the bright geometry of hills learned the dull geometry of cells. Letters arrived slowly, smudged where a wife's thumb had rested too long on the page. News from the river, a birth, a burial, a drought, traveled on paper with the authority and cruelty of fact. Some men took to preaching or carving, some learned to sleep through everything. All learned to live with time as a neighbor who would not move away. At home, the edges softened by degrees nobody could measure until years had passed. Men put rifles back on pegs rather than keeping them by the bed. A McCoy might nod to a Hatfield in a store if a stranger was watching closely. Children grew who knew the names but not the faces, who could point to a hill and say that was where something happened without telling what it felt like to stand there when it did. The feud receded, still present like an old scar, still tender when bumped, but not the first thing the valley said about itself. Even the principals gave ground to time. Devil aunts, who had posed for photographers with the same unsmiling certainty he wore in the woods, found baptism at a riverside, the water filming his beard as he came up. Randell McCoy aged into a man made mostly of angles and memory, the kind of father whose silence fills a room deeper than talk did. None of it undid what had been done. But it taught the living how to go on living. Crowds had made justice a spectacle. Justice, for its part, had made the feud a lesson written in statutes as well as songs. Men in distant cities cited the case when they wished to talk about borders and warrants. Men in the valley cited it when they wished to talk about pride and what it costs. The river kept moving, as rivers do, writing its own law on stone. By the time the last sentence was spoken and the last appeal denied, a quieter order returned, fragile, imperfect, but chosen. The valley began to practice ordinary days again, school bells, sawmills, quilts spread on fences to bleach in winter sun. Newspapers went looking for other sensations. The hills, left to themselves, remembered in the way hills do, not with dates and transcripts, but with certain bends in the road that make a driver slow, with a patch of pawpaw where someone walks faster without thinking why, with a January dawn that still tastes of smoke. What remained was a story people could not agree upon and did not need to. One side would always say the rope was justice, the other, that it was theater. One would call the trials the beginning of peace, the other, the end of mercy. Between them lay a fact neither could move, the graves on both banks and the children who grew around them. The road out of a feud does not run in a straight line. It loops through memory and passes landmarks that refuse to change. But it runs, all the same. And at its far turn, years later, you could find Hatfields and McCoys standing in a single frame, hands on the same banner, acting out a piece their grandparents could not have imagined. The legend had learned how to smile for a camera. The valley had learned, slowly, how to breathe. Soon the story would belong as much to songs and moving pictures as to the people whose names it used. What the feud meant, what it still means, would be argued on stages larger than a courthouse. But for now, the hills were content with smaller ambitions, a winter that passed without gunfire, a spring that brought corn up straight, a river that ran only with water. By the time the last motions were denied and the last sentence fixed in stone, the feud had already slipped its local boundaries. It lived on in people's mouths first, told at dusk on porches, corrected by someone older, embroidered by someone younger, and then in places that had no stake in the tug fork at all. Minstrels found verses that would carry, newspapers learned to make the mountains shiver on the page, and traveling lecturers promised a story that began with a hog and ended with a gallows. The names hardened into emblems. Hatfield and McCoy stopped meaning families you might meet at a store and started meaning a riddle Americans asked themselves about pride, poverty, and how quickly neighbors can become enemies. Stereotypes arrived right on schedule. Outsiders liked a version in which the hills were savage and the people in them half-tamed by whiskey, superstition, and stubbornness. The truth, as always, had more furniture in it: hard ground, thin cash, a law slow to cross water, a country still bleeding from a war that taught men to settle things without asking a clerk's permission. But nuance is a poor traveling companion. It walks while the cartoon rides. For decades, the feud was the cartoon that stood in for Appalachia, and the cost of that caricature was measured in how the region was treated, pitted, joked about, mined for images the way its slopes were mined for timber and coal. Yet the families, those who bore the names and those who married into them, kept living, which is its own counter-argument. Children were born who learned the story the way you learn a weather pattern: it had come, it might come again, and you prepared without talking over much. Men worked in timber and then coal, women held houses together across lean winters, and the river kept its counsel. Some Sundays, on the West Virginia side, a gray-bearded figure stood in water and came up baptized, a warrior submitted to peace. Some evenings, on the Kentucky side, an old man with a face made of angles stood at a window and the glass reflected only his own life back at him. The feud did not end in a single day because it had not begun in one. In time, reunions found their way onto calendars. Tents went up on fields where men had once taken cover, long tables held fried chicken and potato salad where, in other years, cartridges had glittered in the dust. A preacher said grace over both surnames at once. Younger cousins, who knew the story mostly as a family possession, a legend with recognizable furniture and a few disputed corners, posed for photographs with arms thrown over shoulders that would have been enemies' shoulders in another century. Someone would always tell the old jokes to keep the edge from returning, someone else would always set a jar of flowers on the short stone that marked a boy who never reached manhood. Peace does not erase. It layers. Popular culture made its versions too: comic sketches that turned tragedy into punchline, songs that put a banjo under the blood, movies and miniseries that swapped the long grind of years for scenes that could be wrapped before the next commercial. Some told it with care and some without. Either way, the story grew larger than the hollows it had come from. The country learned to use Hatfields and McCoys as shorthand for any quarrel that wouldn't die. The shorthand worked because the original had the logic of myth: two houses, a spark, a ruin, yet the families themselves remained stubbornly particular: real faces, real hunger, real winters, real graves. Tourists came to the river the way readers go to a footnote. They walked the ground, squinted at pawpaw thickets, took the measure of water that a man could shout across and still call a border. They bought postcards stamped with a legend because it is human to want proof that one has been near the place where a famous hurt occurred. The locals, practical as always, learned which stories sold and which remained better kept. Museums collected rifles and photographs, papered the walls with clippings that once tried to make the mountains into a distant circus. Docents spoke the dates with a steadiness that suggested neither apology nor pride. A river cannot apologize for having run red, it can only run clear today. The state found, slowly and late, that the feud made a useful mirror. Politicians could point to it when arguing about borders and jurisdiction, about the reach of a warrant and the obligations of one government to another. Educators used it to pry open conversations about the Reconstruction years and what happens when a nation tries to make peace with itself by telling half its citizens to forget the other half's pain. Economists held it up as a reminder that thin markets and slow courts make honor a currency, and that currency spends dear. The hills, for their part, did not speak this language. They spoke in harvests, in schoolhouses with good roofs, in mines that opened and shut, in men who came home tired and in men who did not come home at all. There were gestures toward closure that felt theatrical and some that felt earned. Both kinds mattered. A handshake taken for a camera sets a tone, a quiet forgiveness given over a kitchen table sets a life. A plaque along a roadside tells travelers that something happened here, a grandmother at a stove tells a child how to keep from making it happen again. In some families the story was told as a warning about whiskey and tempers. In others it was told as a caution about pride and the men who would use it to recruit you to their errand. In all of them there came a moment when someone looked up and said, "Enough, we live here now, not then." If there is a single lesson the feud leaves behind, it might be this: once violence teaches itself to a place, it is hard to make it forget the lesson. What keeps it from reciting is not a single trial or a single hanging, not a governor's letter nor a preacher's sermon, but the stubborn practice of ordinary decency, neighbors choosing not to answer a slight, families choosing to eat together instead of tallying scores, sheriffs choosing to step into a room before it breaks. None of that makes a story that travels well. It makes, instead, a plain life that lasts, which is the better ambition. And still, the legend persists, because legends are useful. They let people elsewhere file a complicated region into a single drawer and label it feud. They let people here remember a time when a wrong answer to a small question, a hog, a mark in an ear, could open the door to a century's worth of telling. The danger of a legend is that it can become a mask a place is forced to wear. The value of a legend is that it can be turned inside out and used as a map. Here is where the ground is soft, here is where we must step carefully. Stand by Tug Fork at evening and the river will give you the closing image for free. The water runs narrow and sure, arguing with stones in a voice too low to make a headline. The light leaves the ridges early, smoke lays flat over cabins, a dog barks, then decides there is no reason to continue. Somewhere behind you, in a cemetery that the map barely troubles to mark, the short stones tell their dates without commentary. Across the way, a porch creaks, and someone lifts a hand in a gesture that is either greeting or habit. It hardly matters which. The important fact is that the hand is empty. What began with a hog made its way through love and murder, through fire and rope, through headlines and history, and arrived, limping but arrived, at a settled quiet. The river keeps its color. The banks keep their distance. The families keep their lives. The story remains, as stories do, because people need to remember what pride can cost. But the place has the last word, and it is not a word at all. It is the sound of water moving over stone, patient as time, indifferent to anger, faithful to its course. Tug Fork runs clear now, and if you watch it long enough, you can almost believe it always did.